Imagine this. You're caught in a subtle dance where your reality is constantly questioned. Short, quiet invalidations slip between ordinary words and become a new grammar of control. In many relationships that appear ordinary from the outside, a sophisticated architecture of influence shapes what she believes about herself. The script begins with a single image, a woman standing before a glass cage, a key resting on its sill, and the key is not turned. That key will be an unresolved thread running through this entire story. She moves through a house that looks like safety but smells faintly of smoke. Short, sharp dismissals arrive like drafts under doors. The narcissistic partner has perfected a choreography: charm, selective memory, redefinition of events, then the soft accusation that she is the one who misunderstands. This creates the first fractured doubt about perception. Jung called this projection of the ego, a shadow thrown outward so the projector never has to meet it. The archetype here is the sovereign queen, who discovers that the crown is hot because someone else forged it for her. Boundaries begin as small lines in sand. Short, bright attempts at saying no are met with bewilderment. When her no is treated as an overreaction, the line erodes. Gaslighting does not arrive as a storm. It arrives as weather, persistent, cumulative, slowly changing the landscape. Attachment wounds are the fertile soil for this weather. An anxious attachment will water any seed of doubt. A dismissive partner will plant it and admire the growth. This part is about diagnosis, noticing how autonomy is smuggled out of a relationship in tiny increments. She learns the language of silence and the syntax of apology. Short pauses become traps. The partner's apologies are rehearsed, their remorse a mirror that always returns the blame. Stoic practice helps here in a small but crucial way: stillness that separates impulse from pattern. In third-person analysis, when the external world unsettles the inner compass, the task is not to punish the other but to restore navigation. Observe the projection. Name the pattern. Keep the internal weather report clear. The sovereign queen begins cataloging moments, not to wage war, but to reclaim factual ground. The open loop grows. The glass cage, the key, and an old ledger found in a drawer filled with rewritten versions of simple conversations. Short entries, the ledger contains notes that contradict memory. The ledger is a symbol of systematized doubt. She stumbles on it and closes it, unsure whether to read further. That hesitation is important. The unresolved ledger is the question that will thread to the final part. If she reads it, what becomes of the narrative she's been handed? If she leaves it closed, what cost will silence demand? A tactical map begins to appear. Short decisions matter more than grand revolutions. Set the small boundary before the big confrontation. Once a boundary is tested and stands, something in the dynamic shifts. In archetypal terms, boundary work is an initiation. The sovereign does not need to be loud, she needs to be consistent. In third person, this is described as a series of calibrated acts, a corrected fact, a named feeling, a withheld energy. In second person, notice the trembling in the throat and speak anyway. Notice that the hand reaches for the ledger and pause. That pause is the hinge of choice. The listener is asked to hold two images at once: the woman in the glass cage and the woman holding the key without turning it. Short question: what would happen if the key was turned? That question will not be answered yet. For now, awareness is the mission. Awareness is not drama. It is methodical light. When reality is questioned, the first act is to anchor perception in small, verifiable facts, then to place those facts like stepping stones across a stream of doubt. This part ends with a quiet fact: control wears the face of care. Short acts of help are often camouflaged power. The descent has been mapped. There is pain, confusion, and a ledger that speaks to orchestrated doubt. The open loop, the key, and the ledger remains unresolved, a tension left like a held breath. The next part will move from diagnosis into the hard, deliberate work of boundary setting, shadow integration, and the moral architecture of saying no. The ledger's presence lingers like a question mark in the room. It feels heavier than the furniture because it holds years of muttered corrections and polite erasures. Short sentences become a refuge when language has been weaponized. The listener is shown, in archetypal terms, how memory itself can be hijacked and then used as evidence against the one who remembers. Small betrayals reveal larger patterns. A withheld invitation, a revised retelling of a shared story, the partner's casual insistence that she is too sensitive, each is a deliberate tilt in the orbit of truth. Short notice. These are not accidents. The solver. Ein Queen's first homework is to distinguish episodic friction from systematic architecture. Attachment wounds are the map the abuser reads. An anxious heart interprets the smallest withdrawal as catastrophe, and a calculated manipulator counts on that urgency. Short observation. Urgency is fertile ground for control. In Jungian language, the projector throws the shadow outward to avoid facing the cost of the inner fracture, and the woman's inner world becomes a battlefield where the rules keep changing. Gaslighting is slow alchemy. It transforms certainty into fog through repetition and the exquisite politeness of denial. Short, sharp fact. Repetition over time is the weapon, not the single lie. The descent is not dramatic. It is an erosion of the baseline, a secret redefinition of what the baseline is. Stoic practice offers a counter-ritual. Return to the ledger of facts. Name what happened with dates and details, not as proof for others but as anchors for the self. Short instruction. Write it down. This is boundary work in embryonic form. Facts are the fences that protect perception from being bulldozed by narrative. The inner critic becomes an accomplice. When someone consistently reframes experience, the mind begins to accept the new grammar. Short admission. Sometimes the mind prefers a stable lie to a chaotic truth. In third-person analysis, the sovereign must excavate the voice that repeated the lie until it sounded like the only voice. Power hides behind kindness. A compliment can arrive tethered to a demand, and help can carry a hidden price. Short warning. Charisma can be camouflage. The listener is taught to parse generosity not by volume but by reciprocity, who keeps paying the emotional tax. The ledger sits unopened again, but the woman's hand reaches toward it more than before. Curiosity is not the same as submission. It is the sovereign's method of reclaiming the story. Short pivot. The key exists because choice still exists. The open loop tightens. If she reads the ledger, will it confirm the manipulation and justify departure, or will it contain subtler traces that require a different kind of work? This part closes with a moral. Awareness is not drama. It is the prelude to discipline. Short line. The descent taught the shape of the trap. The next movement will not be a sudden uprising. It will be deliberate and calibrated. The confrontation begins with boundary work small enough to be sustainable and bold enough to change the field of play. Boundary work begins in whispers, not wars. It does not arrive with declarations but with quiet refusals that surprise even the one who speaks them. Short sentence. The first no is for the self, not for the other. The sovereign queen discovers that the smallest act of self-preservation is revolutionary when she has been trained to dissolve for the comfort of someone else. Boundaries are not walls but agreements. Yet in the narcissistic dynamic, any agreement that limits control is treated as rebellion. Short truth. The abuser experiences her dignity as defiance. This is why the first attempts often provoke rage or ridicule. In Jungian terms, the shadow being denied expression in him rises violently when mirrored by her refusal to host it. The work here is not about convincing him, it is about anchoring her. She must learn the paradox that a boundary is effective even if ignored, because its power lies in her willingness to uphold it. Short advice: say it once, then act. Do not explain the no into dust. Each explanation becomes another opening for manipulation. The archetypal struggle is ancient, the sovereign queen against the trickster king. His power depends on distortion, her power depends on clarity. Short contrast: one thrives in fog, the other demands light. When light enters, fog retreats, not because it chooses to, but because it cannot stay. This is where the confrontation sharpens. The ledger of rewritten conversations becomes less of a threat and more of a tool. She begins writing her own ledger, not just of what happened, but of what she decided. Short act: memory is reclaimed, choice is documented, and the fog has fewer places to hide. This practice itself is boundary work, because it reasserts ownership of narrative. Energy conservation emerges as the hidden law. Every argument drained her because she fought on his stage with his rules. Boundary work pulls her off that stage. Short strategy: withdraw energy where manipulation thrives. Silence, distance, refusal to justify. These become tactics that starve the cycle. It is less about fighting him and more about refusing to be food for his control. Pattern interrupt arrives here. Long analysis has circled fog and sovereignty, but pause. Short, sharp question: but what if the cage was never locked? This jolts the listener back into the immediacy of choice. The bars felt real because they were rehearsed in her nervous system. The key was always hers, though trembling hands often forget there. Strength. Shadow integration is the next layer. She must acknowledge her own collusion, the part of her that found false safety in surrender, the part that feared abandonment so much it preferred distortion. Short compassion: this is not blame, it is honesty. To integrate the shadow is to own the truth that survival strategies once served her, but they cannot serve her liberation. Boundaries mature when they are no longer about reaction but about identity. The sovereign queen no longer says no to him, she lives yes to herself. Short mantra: boundaries are not weapons, they are mirrors. They reflect who she has chosen to be. This transformation unsettles the narcissist, because without her compliance, his architecture collapses. The ledger remains unopened, waiting. Yet now she approaches it not with dread, but with a steadier hand. Short foreshadow: what is written, there will matter less than the fact that she is strong enough to read it. The confrontation has shifted the axis. The next phase will lead into ascent, where she embodies the freedom she has begun to claim. The turn toward ascent is quiet at first, more like an unlearning than a sudden revelation. Short breath: morning comes not because the night is argued with, but because one opens the shutters. In this phase, embodiment replaces strategy. Knowledge becomes muscle memory through repeated, modest acts. The sovereign queen's days begin to rearrange themselves around what keeps her steady, not what keeps him watching. Detach from outcome becomes a practice. Short instruction: act without expectation. This is not indifference but sovereignty, choosing actions because they align with integrity rather than to elicit a response. In Jungian terms, individuation here is not a heroic solo. It is the gradual reclaiming of an inner authority previously ceded to projection. The projector's voice grows thinner when it no longer receives immediate resonance. Rituals of return are small and precise. A morning ledger entry, a 10-minute stoic pause before replies, a consistent bedtime that is guarded from argument. These are tiny acts that accumulate into new identity. Short truth: repetition remaps the nervous system. Each unreactive moment is a new synapse laid down against old grooves of reactivity. The sovereign's court is rebuilt not by dramatic gestures but by daily fidelities. Energy hygiene becomes theological. Protecting attention is the new morality, and reciprocity becomes the sacred text. Short advice: measure where attention goes, withdraw it where it is squandered. The narcissistic architecture depends on attention as currency. When she spends it elsewhere, on work that matters, friendships that nourish, art that fills, his economy collapses. Without a market, manipulation has no profit. The ledger is read now, but on her terms. She opens the pages with a steady spine and scans not for ammunition but for truth. Short observation: truth rearranges the heart more gently than rage. There will be anger, yes, but the first response is clarity. The rewritten conversations, the polite erasures, the passive-aggressive footnotes, these are cataloged and contextualized. They become evidence, not of a case to prosecute, but of a pattern to disengage from. Repair is considered with care. Not every fractured exchange demands repair. Short counsel: choose what merits repair by whether it supports life. Some people can integrate shadow and return with humility. Others will double down. The sovereign learns discernment by testing small reparations and watching whether reciprocity is sincere or performative. This test is not cruelty. It is a boundary refined into a litmus for safety. Community arises as an architecture of support. Reclaiming narrative often requires witnesses who will reflect reality back without agenda. Short note: solitude can heal, but community anchors. Trusted friends, a counselor versed in trauma language, or a group that understands narcissistic patterns become instruments of revalidation. The sovereign does not have to be solitary to be sovereign. Alliance multiplies clarity. The narcissist's response is predictable: escalation when control falters, charm when distance becomes too stable, victim narratives when accountability looms. Short forecast: expect attempts to re-establish old roles. But now the scripts meet new choreography. She may grant empathy without surrender, set firm terms for interaction, or choose distance without spectacle. Each choice is an enactment of new identity. Shadow work continues inwardly. The parts that once sought safety and surrender are met with compassion and new strategies. Short practice: name the old survival story and rewrite its ending. This is not denial of pain. It is a refusal to be governed by it. Integration makes compassion for self practical, less an abstract sentiment, more a policy or default mode of care. Power in this reclaimed form is simple and unspectacular. It is the ability to refuse to be. Made small by someone's need to be large. Short line: power here is a steady heartbeat, not thunder. The sovereign's crown becomes a tool for decision-making rather than a plea for validation. Choices align with values and consequences are consistent. The ledger's final entry is less a verdict than a bookmark. She leaves some pages closed, not out of fear, but because closure sometimes arrives as forward movement. Short metaphor: a closed book can be carried differently than one left open to a wound. The key rests now not as a relic of paralysis, but as an emblem of agency. The question introduced in the first act, what happens when the key is turned, moves closer to an answer, though not yet fully revealed. In the days that follow, the architecture of her life reconfigures. Short image: rooms once seated to doubt become spaces for skill, for pleasure, for quiet competence. The sovereign queen learns the economy of saying less and meaning more. She acts without spectacle. She chooses without apology. The field of play has shifted, and with it, the gravity of the relationship. The open loop tightens toward resolution, but one last test remains: whether identity now rests on internal law or on external compliance. Short challenge: maintain boundaries when provocation escalates. This is the threshold between temporary change and embodied freedom. The next and final movement will show what becomes of the cage, the ledger, and the key. How the sovereign integrates her past into a future where the voice that once policed her perception is no longer the arbiter of truth. She opens the ledger with steady hands, not to prosecute but to understand. Short breath. The pages smell like small compromises and large denials. The entries are precise, mundane, and finally human, corrections that always favor one narrator, footnotes that soften consequences, omissions that become a second truth. In third-person analysis, reading it is an act of reclamation. The ledger ceases to be magic and becomes material. This demystifies the control because once the pattern is mapped, it loses omnipotence. The key sits on the sill and is no longer a myth but a tool. Short question posed to the listener. If the key has always been in her palm, what prevents the turn? The answer will not be a single reason but a constellation: fear of solitude, the habit of caretaking, the nervous system's old calibrations. In Jungian terms, the hand that hesitates holds both the shadow of surrender and the ember of sovereignty. Integration requires both fierce boundary and tender reparenting. Boundaries without compassion calcify. Compassion without boundaries diffuses into old survival loops. She turns the key, though not necessarily to open a door out. Short image. The key is used to unlock the meaning of events, not merely to escape. The cage, for all its glass and reflection, was sustained by consent and by the internalized narrative that she needed permission to be whole. When the ledger's entries are read aloud to witnesses, or written again into a personal ledger of truth, the external architecture begins to wobble. Narcissistic control depends on the projection being accepted. When projection is owned by its source, the projector is exposed and loses audience. This is not a triumphant shout, but a steady, domestic sovereignty. Short instruction. Live the small rituals of self-authority every day. Make the ledger into a map for decisions rather than a script for fear. Practice refusal until it feels ordinary. Surround the truth with community that reflects reality back without hunger. The Stoic practice of indifference to outcomes supports this. Act according to integrity and accept the range of responses without collapsing into reactivity. Future pacing. Imagine the version of you that no longer explains away pain in the name of peace. Short invitation. Picture mornings anchored by small, non-negotiable acts that confirm worth before external praise arrives. In that future, relationships are chosen for mutuality and sanity, not for the uncanny comfort of being needed as a stage for someone else's drama. The sovereign queen steps into rooms where the air is ordinary and stable, and the crown is a functional thing, a steadying posture rather than a demand. Repair happens on clear terms. Short counsel. Offer repair when it is reciprocal and restorative, decline when it is theatrical. For those who seek to return with humility and accountability, tests are given and boundaries remain. For those who escalate, distance is the necessary curriculum. The ledger can be a mirror for learning or a weapon for re-enrollment. Choose the mirror. The narcissistic architecture collapses not because it is struck, but because it is starved of the obedience that sustained it. This embodiment is practical and luminous. Short truth. Freedom is a pattern practiced daily, not a single escape. The identity shift is not an announcement. It is the accumulation of choices that align with inner law. If this video helped you, hit the subscribe button. It's the best way to support the channel and get more deep content like this. Live by the inner ledger. Guard the key with tender courage and remember, power that heals builds more than it breaks.